Just 4 weeks into the college football season, we have already learned a ton about these teams. No more preview magazines, no more people guessing at what's going to happen. We've got actual results to go off of, and we're starting to learn where some of these teams fall. Now, there's still a lot more to be learned during the season, and that's what makes the season so great, and some major matchups upcoming in this week. But I thought right now would be a good time to revisit my tier list from the offseason to kind of just shake things up and really identify where my thoughts are on every team. So in this video, we will be doing the complete Power 4 tier list. Let's start by identifying the names of the tiers that we're going with. We've got 5 tiers here, which is national title contenders, college football playoff contenders, solid bowl teams, sketchy bowl teams, and the season is over. Before we start each tier, I'll go in depth about what each one means. So let's start with the national title contenders. These are the cream of the crop teams that I think can win a national title and are right in the thick of the mix this season. So starting into the tier, let's throw Georgia and Texas in there because I think those are the two most obvious ones. Now, Texas has looked virtually flawless. They already have a massive win over Michigan, a win that aged well with Michigan getting the victory over USC. Yes, Quinn Ewers is injured, but Texas's quarterback depth is unrivaled. They have Arch Manning out there right now. They've really just been everything you've wanted to see, which includes an elite defense and offensively humming, looking fantastic this season. And then you've got the Georgia Bulldogs. Obviously, that's one of the big bads in college football and a team that you can't count out, even though they looked a little sloppy versus Kentucky. They haven't flashed their full potential yet, but we've seen Georgia teams struggle early in the season in games like that. Like, think back to last year. They struggled versus Auburn early in the season. And then the year before that, they struggled the last time they were in Lexington. So we've seen these things from Georgia before. Still a team I think you have to say is a national title contender. Otherwise, you are lying to yourself. Elsewhere in the same tier, we have Ohio State, Alabama, and Tennessee. That's it. Just 5 teams in this tier. I think it's a very exclusive group, and I'm aware that 4 of these teams are SEC teams. I feel a little icky about that, but there's a few teams I wanted to put in there, but I just couldn't quite bring myself to, and we'll talk about them because they're in the next tier. But with the Ohio State Buckeyes, we have not really learned anything. It might as well still be the offseason. They have just played the worst teams ever. They played Akron, they played Marshall, they played Western Michigan. Like, they haven't done anything or played anyone that even registers. They play at Michigan State this week, so we will learn a little bit more about them, and that will be good. In the case of Alabama, Alabama has already had a bit of a test at Wisconsin, and they completely flattened them. And they did play a good South Florida team as well that they ended up pulling away late from. So we're going to learn a lot more about Alabama this week when they host the Georgia Bulldogs. But for now, I'm comfortable with the Crimson Tide being listed as a national title contender. I just think they're up there near the top tier. They've got the roster clearly to compete, and Ryan Williams has been absolutely electric. They have a very explosive offense. And then we have Tennessee. Tennessee is a team I had in the top 10 in the offseason. I really thought they could make something happen, and they've looked fantastic. Tennessee, arguably just pure resume, arguably has the most impressive one right now. They destroyed NC State, which, yes, I'm aware that NC State team might not be too great this year. They've been destroyed by a couple of teams in Tennessee and Clemson now. And then Tennessee getting the statement win at Oklahoma, where they only ended up winning by 10, but the game was never in doubt in the second half. Tennessee controlled that throughout. So the Volunteers, I think, are a national title contender with the position Nico puts them in and the way their defense is playing right now. I've got them in that top tier. Let's get into the next tier here, which is the college football playoff contenders tier. Teams that I think are definitely the top tier contenders to make the playoff and to win their conferences and really make a run at things. But I don't think they're quite at the level that I would consider them a threat to win the national title or a team that was going to be one of the favorites to win the national title. And I'm definitely a little bit more conservative with my national title contenders tier. There is probably like 3 teams from this tier that most people would have up a tier. And we start with USC. USC is in the college football playoff contenders tier. I think a lot of people, based on what they've seen from USC this year, would agree. They lost a close game at Michigan that they could have won. They have the high-quality win over LSU from earlier in the year. The Trojans are a team that I was concerned about in the offseason. I didn't have them in my top 25 because I knew that they were attempting a defensive overhaul, and I was worried that that could get worse before it gets better when you're overhauling a defense like that. However, the overhaul, I should say, looks like it almost happened overnight. Like, USC's defense is night and day under D'Anton Lynn, and so for that reason, I'm comfortable bumping them up a tier and putting a lot more faith in them because they're playing a style of football they haven't previously been able to do under Lincoln Riley. You've got Ole Miss. The Ole Miss Rebels just haven't played anyone. In the offseason, I probably would have had them in this same tier, maybe close, teetering on national title contender, but we just haven't seen them play a team with a pulse yet. So we'll see what happens against Kentucky this week. We still might not learn a ton from Ole Miss, but definitely a team that is a serious threat, and I think a serious contender that can be in the mix. You've got the Clemson Tigers. Clemson looks kind of dead in the water versus Georgia, but Georgia can do that to teams, and now Clemson has bounced back really well. Their offense looks absolutely fantastic, and that was their concern, was their offense. So if their offense can continue to hum, we could absolutely see Clemson in the playoffs and win the ACC at the end of the year. We've got Iowa State in this tier. It's a team I was extremely high on comparatively to everybody else in the offseason. I had them at 14th in my preseason top 25. They beat Iowa. That's a quality win early in the season, and I think in the Big 12, it's starting to open up. Like, things could happen, and Iowa State could be in a position to win the Big 12, to be in the Big 12 title game, which I had them in the preseason. I just really trusted how much young guys they had, how many young guys they had that were going to get better. They had the most freshman snaps of any team in the entire country last year, and I really just trust this offense as well, and the offense made some plays against Iowa. I think they're going to continue to do well. They took care of business against a solid Arkansas State squad. So Iowa State's a team I really like, and I'm very comfortable having in this tier. Kansas State in here as well. I'm aware they just lost by 29 on the road to BYU. I watched the game. Everything went BYU's way. Kansas State outgained them by like several hundred yards, and they got crushed. And that's the type of game that I think when we look back at the end of the season, we're going to say, wow, that was just bad timing, wrong place, wrong time for Kansas State. I'm confident that this team will be able to bounce back. I think they'll probably beat Oklahoma State when they play them this week, and I think Kansas State will get back into Big 12 title contention and by osmosis get back into playoff contention. We'll continue with the other half of the teams in this tier of the college football playoff contenders. You've got the team like the Utah Utes. I think they're still the favorite to win the Big 12. I'm a little nervous with their quarterback situation. Cam Rising, they're doing the thing where his status is up in the air every single week. Isaac Wilson has looked fine. He hasn't looked fantastic. Their defense is definitely championship level. We'll see what happens. Hopefully the attrition doesn't hit them quite like it did last season. You got the Miami Hurricanes. Miami was one of those two teams I was talking about that I really considered putting in the national title contenders tier. I was super high on Miami. I had them as a borderline top 10 team the whole offseason. I love Cam Ward and what this team is. I thought Ward could be a Heisman contender potentially, and he's looked just like that. I just don't know if Miami has shown enough for me to make that leap yet. I definitely think they're capable of running the table and winning the ACC, but I just need to see that actually happen. I don't know if I trust them against the Georgias and the Texases and the Ohio States and the Bamas of the world. Like, I don't really see a scenario where I would pick Miami in that game yet. It's an extremely high standard to be held to, and Miami should feel good that they're even getting talked about in adjacent to that conversation even after what things have been in recent memory. We got the LSU Tigers. They had that close loss to USC. I think that one could have gone either way. A lot of people giving LSU flack. Yes, the South Carolina game happened, but guess what? You win that one, you lose the one at USC. The way I see it, they were probably going to come out with one loss out of that anyways. I think that Brian Kelly can still turn this thing around, and there's a pathway where LSU can right the ship and find a college football playoff path, especially if USC can have a nice successful season in the Big Ten. LSU can have that on their resume to bolster, and maybe LSU could be the type of team that goes 9-3 and makes the college football playoff. We've seen how they finished the year the last couple of seasons under Brian Kelly. You've got Louisville, a Louisville team that hasn't truly been really tested. They played Georgia Tech, which is a solid Georgia Tech team, so I guess you could consider that a test. They got a way bigger one this week at Notre Dame. I just think the Brom team is one that I really put a lot of faith in because of their transfer portal class being really strong again. I got a little nervous when we saw what happened to Florida State that maybe the portal volatility would catch up to this team, but I don't think that's the case. I think they're really good and in a position. I like how Shuck has looked so far. Tyler Shuck, the transfer from Texas Tech, has performed well. We've got Missouri. Missouri is a little concerning to me. They're a team that I don't know if I would have ever put in national title contenders, but they would have been in a higher position in this tier. I almost considered dropping them out of this tier after that performance versus Vanderbilt, a rough performance versus Boston College, and I think the most concerning part is both of those games were at home. So for Missouri, they got to figure some things out. Brady Cook has really struggled. Luther Burden hasn't been as explosive as some people would have hoped. It's an extremely high standard, but it's the one they're holding him to, and so I'm concerned for them. Penn State has also had a little bit of issues, mainly in that game versus Bowling Green. I think people are going to use bad faith Bowling Green arguments against them until they play somebody legit. But I really do put a lot of stock in how explosive that offense looked against West Virginia. And I think this week against Illinois, they might wake up and be up for the test and be aggressive with their play calling and have a similar performance to kind of silence some of those critics. And then here's the other team I considered putting in national title contenders, and that's the Oregon Ducks. I definitely had them in that tier in the offseason, and I definitely believed in them. but their start out of the gate was so slow and so ugly that I just don't know. It's almost like a wait and see. Let's see what happens when the Buckeyes come into town. Let's see what happens when they have to go on the road versus Michigan. How will this team respond? How will this team evolve throughout the season? Then maybe I'll consider moving them up a tier. And that's the reason why right now the national title contenders tier is 4 SEC teams and 1 Big Ten team, because I had another one in Oregon that I thought about moving up, another one in Miami, but I've abstained from doing that. If I had to put one per conference, maybe I'd put Utah, Miami, and Oregon up a tier, but that's not what I've decided to do. And then you got the Michigan Wolverines. How could I forget about the Wolverines? A really impressive, emphatic win versus USC. They've discovered their winning formula, and their winning formula is ugly. It probably slightly lowers their total ceiling for the season, but it is a way they can win a lot of games, and they can quote-unquote save this season that some people thought could be rough after their loss to Texas. Michigan still has all their goals in front of them. Are they going to win the national title this season? They will not. Not with that quarterback play, not with the way that offense looks. But can they win a lot of games and make a college football playoff run? Absolutely they can. This next tier is another one that's pretty self-explanatory. Solid bowl teams. Teams that I think are just really solid bets for a bowl game, maybe fringe college football playoff contention, but really what we're talking about with these teams is making a bowl game, turning in a solid season. With Oklahoma, it's the case where they're staring down the barrel of potentially 5 losses with how rough their quarterback play has been. Maybe Hawkins can turn things around offensively, but the O-line has really struggled. Quarterback play has suffered as a result. Their defense definitely has stepped up, and Brent Venables delivering on that side of the football as many expected him to do. But because of the way things are on offense, this is going to be basically a transition year for Oklahoma, as many people predicted it would be in the SEC. You've got Nebraska. The Cornhuskers have looked like just such a better team this year with Raiola at quarterback. He's been a nice, calming presence for them. It was a really tough loss versus Illinois, kind of ruined the dream of starting like 7-0 prior to that Ohio State game with that soft schedule. And even some of those other games are looking tougher. They play Indiana and Rutgers still. So for Nebraska, things looking a lot more rocky than they appeared in the offseason, but still a really good team with a really great defense in the Big Ten to match. Texas Tech is a team that I was surprised by when they lost to Washington State, but they also got a nice win over Arizona State. So it's kind of been a tale of highs and lows. They also went to overtime versus Abilene Christian and smoked North Texas. So, just a lot of weird stuff. The Red Raiders been very bipolar, trying to figure things out. I think they'll be a solid bowl team. They'll make a bowl game, but I don't see a scenario where this team is the one that makes a run to the Big 12 title game and surprises everyone just because of how inconsistent they've been in the early going. You got the Iowa Hawkeyes, a team that is just still the Iowa Hawkeyes. They're probably going to lose 3 more super close games and win 5 more super close games. Their offense, I will say, is much improved this year. It looks a lot better. It's an actual threat at times, and that's been really interesting to watch. It hasn't necessarily resulted in a much better team. They did lose that game to Iowa State, an Iowa State team I do really respect. So maybe Iowa can make something happen, but as usual, under their current structure and regime and play style, they don't really have a shot at winning a Big Ten title and don't really have a shot at a playoff bid through that route. Maybe an at-large bid if they're able to navigate their schedule and win a game they're not expected to. We'll see. Pitt has been a team that's really surprised me. They changed strategies and brought in Nate Yarnell to be their new offensive coordinator. Or no, Nate Yarnell, I believe, is the name of the quarterback. Cade Bell is what I meant to say. Cade Bell is the new offensive coordinator, and their offense has looked a lot better, and it's because of Eli Holstein. Again, my pronunciation's bad. At least I got the OC right eventually. It's been really encouraging stuff. So Pitt is not a team I would have had in this tier. I would have had them close to sketchy bowl team probably, but here they are. Boston College, another example. Bill O'Brien's done a great job in 1 year taking advantage of the talent, using a very nice portal class to actually have this team competitive and playing well. Cal's a team, surprising in the early going, winning that game against Auburn. Fernando Mendoza has been nice at quarterback, and tough loss last week against Florida State, but it was a bounce-back game for the Seminoles. Cal still, I think, can be a solid team and make things happen. You got SMU coming off of just a dream performance versus TCU. They blew them out of the water. Everything went their way. SMU might have actually figured some stuff out. They looked pretty bad in the early going. I was concerned about their O-line. I was concerned about the way they were playing. And offensively, I think they answered a lot of questions and figured out a lot of issues last week that give me a little bit more faith in SMU to actually be closer to what people thought they would be this season, which is a fringe top 25 team. And for TCU, what a disappointing start to the season, choking a giant lead versus UCF, getting blown out by SMU in that fashion. A lot of people, I think, had TCU labeled as a Big 12 sleeper. They're clearly not really going to be that anymore. But I think TCU can still be a team that wins some games, gets to a bowl game. They're a talented team. They've just had really bad luck. It's like they used up all their luck in 2022 with that national title run to the national title game. Texas A&M still in the top 25 somehow. They're definitely not that caliber of team this year, I don't think, but a team that I think could still make some things happen. Reed comes in at quarterback. He's looked solid for them and effective. I just think they got a little bit too much credit for that win over Florida. I'm kind of confused about their current ranking status. They got a big one versus Arkansas. It's a pretty big swing game for determining how their season goes, but if they can win just the games they're projected to win, they could turn in a solid 7 or 8 win season this year. Georgia Tech is a team I touched on earlier. I think they're really solid. I love what Brent Key is doing with that program as a whole, and I'm excited to see them continue to play. They've got a really tough schedule, so this is one of the only teams in this tier where I think they belong in this tier, but I don't actually think they'll make a bowl game most likely because of how tough Georgia Tech's schedule is. Oregon State is a team that has also really surprised me. They have managed to maintain their physical edge on the offensive side of the football and really enforce their will on some of these teams they've played so far this year. San Diego State, Purdue. The Purdue one is what really surprised me. The Ducks obviously overpowered the Beavs, and that one was over little ways into the third quarter, but that was to be expected. Their performances versus some of those other teams, and mainly that Purdue game, really promising and encouraging stuff for the rest of the season, and they have a pseudo Mountain West schedule that they can definitely navigate. And then, of course, there's Virginia Tech, another one that's been a little disappointing in the early going. Obviously, the loss to Vanderbilt is rough. They just got beat at home by Rutgers. Not going to be the ACC contender, not going to be the top 25 team that some people thought they could be, but it'll be a step in the right direction, another bowl appearance. If they can get to 7-5, show some improvement, I think things could happen, and I trust Kyron Drones and Brent Pry and his staff to find out what has not been working and fix it. Continuing on in the solid bowl team tier, we've NC State, another team that I think has been really, really disappointing. A team people thought could contend in the ACC that has fallen completely flat early in the season, getting smoked by Clemson, getting smoked by Tennessee. A lot of people are writing off this team right now, and I just think they're too well coached to just fall to the wayside, go 4-8, miss a bowl game or something like that. I think they'll battle back. I think they'll make a bowl game, and it wouldn't surprise me with the state of the rest of the ACC if we look back at the end of the season and we say, NC State turned in an 8-5 season with a bowl win, because that's kind of what Dave Doran does best. Maryland's a team that had the disappointing loss at home to Michigan State. Billy Edwards Jr., I think, has looked pretty good, and Maryland overall, I think, probably caught in a bit of a transition year, but they can still have a high-quality season, and that's why they're in this solid bowl tier. Talk about a team I wouldn't have had here in the season to start the season, Illinois. I mean, how did I overlook these guys? Barry Lenny Jr. had their passing offenses one of the most effective in the Big Ten last season. It's a low bar, but still an impressive feat. And now they're right back this year, looking great. Luke Altmaier goes on the road against Nebraska, cooks, and their defensive level has improved. They had a lot of injury issues on the defensive side of the ball, and without those in the early going, Brett Bielema's squad, one of the biggest surprises in the sport. And Washington State, also a huge surprise. They beat Texas Tech and Washington, a couple of games that not a lot of people thought they were going to win. John Mateer is electric. He can run the ball like crazy. And Jake Dickert, once again, gets the Cougs off to a fast start. Can they continue to win games down the stretch? That's been the issue under Dickert. After a couple fast starts, they faltered down the stretch. Hopefully they can keep it together against mainly Mountain West competition from here on out. And then there's Washington, the team that fell to Washington State. I think this is a solid team in Washington. Their performance versus Northwestern was very encouraging, very clearly not as good as last year, as some Huskies fans would have tried to tell you. But in Jed Fish's first year, no reason to think they can't get to a bowl game. BYU, another major surprise. They smoked Kansas State, and I think they are a really good team. Jake Retzlaff has been surprisingly effective as a passer, and their defense has been just locked down. Really love to see the improvements they made over the offseason in Big 12, and they look like an actual Big 12 team this year. But I do think they'll find a way to lose some of those games in conference play, and down the stretch, that they'll probably get dinged with a couple conference losses. I don't know if I buy them as a legitimate Big 12 contender fully, but I acknowledge there's a path. Anything can happen in the Big 12, basically. Notre Dame is a team I considered having a tier higher, but I'm going to keep them here. Their offense is just not good enough this year. They do have a very manageable schedule, and logic would tell you I think they're a CFP contender, but their schedule is just so weak. I think at 10-2, Notre Dame isn't an at-large team even in the college football playoff. Even with their brand name, the schedule is weak enough that I just don't think it'll happen. And I think they'll probably lose another one, at least one more. And it looks at this point like their 66-point explosion versus Purdue was the exception to the rule. That is poor offense for Notre Dame. Rutgers, the Scarlet Knights, off to an undefeated start, a quality win on the road versus Virginia Tech. Really encouraged by everything I've seen with the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, and I really think that they're a team that could make some noise in the Big Ten and not obviously make any Big Ten title pushes or anything. The top tier is too tough to break through, but Rutgers can win some games that we're not used to seeing Rutgers football win, and I think that's pretty exciting stuff. West Virginia getting a huge win that they really needed against Kansas last week. I think that they can right the ship here and start to figure things out. Nothing too crazy. I think they just ran into a couple of teams that were having, with the Pitt game, it was a very emotionally fueled rivalry game, and then with Penn State was just a better team. Michigan State, Jonathan Smith, also a pleasant surprise this season. Their defensive front has been a little bit better than I thought they would be after all those portal losses they had late. Aiden Childs has been a little disappointing, a little more turnover prone than you'd like to think, but I'd like to think that he can turn that around later in the season, and if he protects the football, Michigan State could be set up for a pretty good season. We'll see if they have an upset bid against Ohio State this week. UCF, another team still undefeated. KJ Jefferson really settling in there, and they have the come-from-behind victory versus TCU. They play a game against Colorado this week that a lot of eyes are going to be on. They'll have a chance to make a statement. Gus Malzahn's squad looking good. Maybe he'll get that call from Auburn with the position they're in right now. Oklahoma State, another team that has been very, very, very disappointing. The offensive line has looked terrible. They can't run the football. Bowman is still turnover prone, and defensively, they have shown some signs of improvement, which is nice, but offensively, there's just no juice there this season, and Oklahoma State, I don't think, is going to win the Big 12 with this team, unless we see more Mike Gundy blood magic, which I suppose he's capable of doing, so maybe I should have bumped them up a tier, just simply out of blind faith in Mike Gundy. Last but not least, we have Syracuse. Syracuse has the portal additions. Kyle McCord looks fantastic. It wasn't going to be an overnight rebuild college football playoff contender. They lose last week in a tough one against Stanford. It's a tough pill to swallow, but definitely a team that's going to win some quality games in the ACC, get to a bowl game, and make something happen there. Love how McCord has looked so far for them this season. So we've made it to the sketchy bowl teams tier. These are just teams where it's going to be sketchy. Whether or not they're going to make a bowl game this season, it's going to be in doubt likely for the whole rest of the season, and I'm just not sure. And they're not as good as the teams above them. I don't have as much faith. You start with Florida State. Obviously, they're off to a disastrous start to the season. I think their offense has been pretty pathetic. Their defense has been kind of solid. And it's just been a complete disaster with everything they tried to do on the offensive side of the ball this year. And because they already have 3 losses and because it feels like there's no guaranteed wins, it's going to be extremely sketchy. The Florida Gators, another one. They just have such a tough schedule this year. It's going to be sketchy. And it also seems like Florida isn't that great of a team. We've seen them get smoked against A&M and Miami already on the season. So just one of those things where there's no gimmies for either of those schools. South Carolina, Beamer ball, I love it. Lenore Sellers, I love it. On the defensive side of the ball, I think they're absolutely cooking as well. The defensive front has been extremely impressive. Dylan Stewart, the true freshman, are you kidding me with how well he's played so far in the season? I love South Carolina, but it's the SEC, man. There are no gimmies left on the schedule. Not even Vanderbilt's a gimme this year. So I'm a little, sussed out for South Carolina, especially losing a game like that against LSU, man. That can be deflating. You've got a Cincinnati team off to a nice start. Obviously, they lose that game to Pitt for a come-from-behind victory for the Panthers. That's a tough one to swallow, especially because they nearly did the same thing last year. They did end up winning that game. So for Cincinnati, I think they've got a lot of talented players. Sorsby has looked good and played good. I like Sorsby, but it's going to be sketchy, man. I don't think they're going to be favored in very many Big 12 games down the stretch. Maybe that home game against ASU. Kentucky is a team that I just don't like at all this year. I didn't really like them in the offseason, and they've come out and they've fallen pretty flat in a lot of games. The one game they got up for was Georgia, but they've done that the last couple of years in Lexington. It seems like that's just something they do. But there's just not a lot of things that make me have a ton of faith in Kentucky. And then you have Kansas, not used to being in this tier under Lance Leipold. They've been great the last couple of seasons, and now at 1-3 in Big 12 play, can we trust them to win enough games? Can we trust them to win 5 out of 8 now to make a bowl game? So, I don't know. Arizona State, the Sun Devils have been a very pleasant surprise, and the fact that they're only in this tier after being a pleasant surprise shows you the situation they were kind of in. Sam Levitt has been a dog. He's been cooking this year. That defense has really stepped up in some key positions. They have some quality wins. They just took a tough loss to Texas Tech. It's Big 12 play. Nothing's going to come easy, and for Arizona State, you just got to see a little bit more to show that they're capable of making that push to a bowl game, and so we'll see how it goes for them. Sort of rounding out the sketchy bowl teams tier, we've got Colorado. The Buffaloes, another Big 12 team. I talked about how many coin flip games are there. With Colorado, I feel like there's just so many variables that even if they were a significantly better team than they are, they would still be a sketchy bowl team because of all the random crap on and off the field that could happen. It's going to be like a projected one-score game for like nearly every single one of Colorado's remaining games, and that's pretty exciting TV. You kind of love to see it. Northwestern is a team that it just seems like the magic for David Braun has kind of run out. They have no Big Ten West to hide behind. They're still capable of getting down, getting dirty, winning some of those games. That's the reason I didn't bump them fully down a tier, but certainly is very, very sketchy for them. Maybe the sketchiest for them out of any other team in this tier. Duke, off to a 4-0 start. They only need 2 more wins to get there. However, you look at the teams they played, you look at how close they played them. This could genuinely be a bad Duke team still, and we just haven't seen them with a large enough sample size. Feels like one of those teams where it could be they start 4-0 in an easy non-conference and then go like 1-7 in conference play and miss a bowl game or something like that. So we'll see what happens with Duke. North Carolina, they just got beat by 70 at home, or not by 70. They got 70 given up on them. They ended up losing by like 20, I think. And then Mack Brown offered his resignation after the game. Kind of flew under the radar, but that happened. And so I'm really concerned for North Carolina for the rest of the season. Are they going to be able to get those 3 additional wins to get to bowl eligibility, or are things falling apart for Mack Brown's squad? We'll see. They play Duke this next week, so the winner of that game will be in a much better position to make a bowl game. Minnesota, PJ Fleck, tough loss at home. Kind of got torched by Iowa, and they already have the loss to North Carolina earlier this season. And Fleck is a guy that I think could be nearing actual real hot seat talk, which is tough. You think back to what seems like forever ago when they got that quality win over Penn State, and people thought Minnesota was arrived and ascending, and it just has not panned out that way. You've got Indiana, another Big Ten team. They're off to a 4-0 start as well. Similar situation to Duke. They have blown out their competition at least, but they've played significantly worse competition, like the worst FCS team, arguably the worst power conference team, and 2 of the worst group of 5 teams as well. So Indiana, you just got to see him play anyone with a pulse for me to move that far off of my preseason and offseason stance on them. The Virginia Cavaliers, off to a solid start. They got that road win at Wake Forest, which is a game you didn't exactly expect them to pull out. Obviously, they lost that game to Maryland, but then the win over Coastal Carolina. So Virginia, I think, in a spot with a couple more wins than some might have expected them to have at this point. Still going to be sketchy in ACC play. Stanford's another team. They got one you didn't expect them to get, and that was at Syracuse. They're in a much better position. I think Virginia and Stanford, I both would have had bottom tier going into the season, but now they're both in a much better spot. We've got Arkansas, the Razorbacks, a team that just got a victory in SEC play on the road versus Auburn. That was an awesome win for them. They play Texas A&M. If they get that win, maybe you start to feel a little bit more comfortable, but it's the same thing. It's the SEC. You can lose pretty much every game every week. Wisconsin is the final one here. Quarterback injuries, how stagnant the offense has looked. I just don't have a ton of faith in Wisconsin, and it really feels like there's so many more Big Ten teams that just have so much more going for them than Wisconsin. Not a team I expected to have in this tier, and yet here they are. And at long last, we have reached the bottom tier, which is the season is over. Now, I'm a firm believer that college football teams' seasons aren't ever really over. Like, you can continue battle even when you're not bowl eligible anymore. It's a regular season sport, and beating your rival can still be fulfilling. Winning close games over other teams, it's still a fun thing to do. But with semantics, yeah, the season's basically over for these teams based on what I've seen as far as any real aspirations outside of getting a fun win on a Saturday. UCLA is a team that I suspected would be one of the worst in the power conferences. They showed like a weird flash of something against LSU last week, so maybe I'm wrong, but they did also get crushed by Indiana at home, and I look at it through a Big Ten lens and say, if they're getting crushed by Indiana at home, what wins are they getting in conference play? The answer is very few. Vanderbilt is a team that got a high-quality win over Virginia Tech, but that loss to Georgia State cooked them, man. Their season is pretty much cooked. In the SEC, they're not going to win very many games. Maybe they'll spring a crazy upset over like a Kentucky or a South Carolina. I'm not too familiar with who they even play. I just know it's bleak because it's Vanderbilt and it's an SEC schedule. Houston is probably actually the worst power conference team. They got blanked by Cincinnati, who isn't exactly an insanely good team. They got beat by like 17 or 20, I think it was, at home against UNLV. Or I believe that was actually on the road, to be fair. But they're still not a very good team. Purdue's another one. They got shelled by Notre Dame. They got shelled by Oregon State. Oregon State ended up beating them by 17. They could have beat them by a lot more. It's a Purdue team that just has not panned out in the way you hope. And with a guy like Hudson Card and Ryan Walters, you really thought they would have had a little bit more juice this year. Just has not been the case. Mississippi State's a team. They got shelled at home by Toledo. And at that point, it just felt like their season's over. They're coming off a loss to Florida. Not a lot of room for them to get many wins in conference play. Maybe they can pull out an insane upset win in the Egg Bowl, and that's what they have to look forward to. Baylor may be cooked. They really needed that game at Colorado. It's one of the ones you circle in the preseason with a coach that's on the hot seat, with a team that needs wins, as this is one we've got to get, and they didn't get it. They're in a tough spot. If they upset BYU this year or this week, maybe that's something they can ride to a better season, but it really feels like it's over for Baylor. Wake Forest, the loss to Virginia as a backbreaker early in the season. You were hoping Dave Clawson would show you something, prove he can thrive in this new college football era. Last time they had a great season was that year Pitt won the ACC. They were in the ACC title game, and how quickly things have fallen off on the back end of that. And so for Wake Forest, you just hope to see something, but I just don't think it's going to come from them this season. And then finally, we have the Auburn Tigers. Auburn, a team that just lost to Arkansas. It really feels like they're cooked. They just don't have a good team. And now you've got Hugh Freeze going and ranting on podcasts about how he doesn't think he has a good team either. And it's just not a good look. Auburn is dysfunctional. And like I said earlier, they're probably going to give Gus Malzahn a call. I just didn't even think in Auburn's worst scenario they'd be down here. And yet here they are after just how bad they've looked in the early going. But that does it for this updated Power Conference tier list. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know I always enjoy doing these types of videos. Let me know down in the comments if there's anything you disagree with or any logic, I guess, you have questions on with this. I'm super excited for this upcoming week of college football. I think we're going to learn a lot about a lot of these teams. Some of this stuff may age well, some of it may age poorly. But as usual, if you enjoyed it, go ahead, like, comment, subscribe, do all the good stuff, and I will see you guys later this week.